Nearly 36 and a half years ago, I was ordained a priest. And it occurred to me when I was looking at these readings a week or so ago that I have managed to somehow go all these years without preaching on this morning's selection from the Gospel according to Luke with that gloriously cheerful last line. When you have done all you were ordered to do, say, we are worthless slaves. We have only done what we ought to have done. Doesn't get any better than that, does it? In my 3.5 decades plus, I must say that it has never occurred to me to quote Jesus to a parishioner who has asked, is there anything I can do to increase my faith? With, you're a worthless slave. What do you expect? What do you expect? Now, if you think this morning we're in for a rough road, let me assure you, it will get better. In a few minutes, I'm going to talk about stewardship of financial resources, or money. Hold your applause, please. Somewhere in between my initial reaction to preaching on this with no guts, no glory, to Jesus is just messing with our minds, I actually saw some good news in this exchange found in Luke, and I want to make certain that we note it. So let's begin. The apostles went to Jesus and they said, increase our faith. Now, by the way, we sometimes hear the disciples called disciples, and we sometimes hear the disciples called apostles. Jesus had a lot of disciples, well beyond the 12 that we know so well. In one case, he sent 70 out to the next town to prepare the way for him. Disciples were merely those who were taught by him, or those who identified themselves as sitting at our Lord's feet. In those terms, Lazarus and his sisters Mary and Martha were disciples. Apostles, on the other hand, were those who were not only disciples, but were selected by him, and then later in the case of Matthias, by the apostles themselves, when Judas Iscariot took his own life, to actually go out and change the world. That was their job. It also may have been a term used in the first century to speak of the leadership of the church. And Paul, as we all know, became an apostle as well when the original apostles welcomed him aboard. But back to our story, in which they said, increase our faith. Well, Jesus seemingly said, no, I'm not going to do that, at least in the way that you want it. And that puzzles me. Maybe it puzzles all of us. Why would he not just click his heels and then, not unlike his changing water into wine or raising the dead to life, just increase their faith? Could have been so simple. Well, it's hard to say, of course, but it might have been that Jesus was actually content playing the hand that he had been dealt. And if that's possible, if he was but content, then it helps to put what is below that initial exchange involving the conduct of a slave in context. But before we talk about that, it's probably important to remember that slavery was not only legal, but also socially and religiously accepted back then. It's the way the world worked. There was a layered society, everybody knew where they fit, and things worked out pretty well. Slaves were at the bottom of the barrel, a status they shared, by the way, with women. And despite the fact that during the time of the Old Testament, some women were absolutely venerated and had significant power, not unlike Deborah, by the time the first century rolled around, women largely were uneducated, could not hold property, and basically kept to the home. One is very hard-pressed to see them often as anything other than owned by their fathers and then their husbands when they were sold or traded into a marriage. Now, I swear, this sermon is going to get better and more cheerful because, after all, I promised we're going to talk about stewardship of financial resources in a minute or two. But continuing on with just what we heard. Note that Jesus begins by saying to these guys, who among you would not say to your slave? And that's important. In that, these disciples, these particular apostles, would have not thought unkindly about where he was headed in this little speech of his. They were in a station in life where they could probably maybe imagine having a slave or two. Maybe in their previous lives, prior to being on the road with their Lord, their family or folks, or maybe they knew themselves to be people with slaves. Who knows? So they could understand that analogy, and it wouldn't in the slightest degree be troubling to them. But then, undoubtedly, causing their heads to just rise with a snap, Jesus rhetorically turned them into the slaves themselves. That couldn't have been very comfortable. Of course, if they thought about it, they would have seen that they were owned lock, stock, and barrel by him. And yet, this is precisely the part where the story becomes fabulously filled with good news. Remember, they were dissatisfied with who they were. They saw themselves as limited. They wanted to be better than as they found themselves. They wanted more faith than they had. And maybe they wanted to be more virtuous because they felt they were not good enough as they were, that being folks with mediocre faith at best. Boy, that sounds familiar. I met a guy just like that not too long ago. I looked in the mirror this morning as I was shaving. We're like that. We identify with that kind of troubled sense of self. And so they asked for more faith, perhaps just to be like Jesus. They had to have been tired of this struggle they were in, trying to believe that they were somehow headed to a world that was absolutely permeated by God's grace. Possibly they wanted more faith so that they could see greater meaning in the battle that they found themselves. After all, in their world, much of what they were doing actually didn't make a lot of sense. And further, they knew they were who they were and what they had, and boy, was that problematic at best. However, for Jesus, their discipline in following him was all that was required. In other words, they were exactly who their Lord needed and exactly who their Lord could use. And further, they didn't have to be better than they were to be sent out as apostles to work, to turn the way that the world worked absolutely upside down. Even as mere slaves, they were wonderfully sufficient to the cause. That's the good news that is found in this. And so Jesus used these men and women and even slaves to further his ministry. He didn't have to have them all go down to Flathead Valley Community College and be retrained and reconfigured as people with more faith. As they were with their discipline of simply following him, they were exactly who they needed to be. They were exactly who they needed to be in order to get others in their surroundings to revel in the love of God and the forgiveness of sins. In the apostles' company, Jesus had all the faith that was needed, and as long as they hung on to him, they would be just fine as well, faith-wise. Well, I told you this was going to be a stewardship sermon. And believe it or not, I'm nearly done with it being so all along. Stewardship is just the art of making choices. And it depends upon, first of all, understanding who you are. You and I are absolutely the beloved of God's. In other words, stewardship begins with knowing that we are absolutely invaluable to the cause as we are, and not as we may think ourselves needing to be. You and I have the power and we have the authority. In short, we have everything it takes. We have the moxie by virtue of our baptism to turn this world into the dream that God imagines it to be, to use that oft-quoted line from the presiding bishop, Michael Curry. This week in the mail, you're going to receive our newly revised ministry narrative. This is the only copy that exists right at the moment. It's the proof. It's amazing. It really pretty well summarizes everything that we've been doing over these last 12 months. And when you look at it, and then you think of the size of our congregation, I think you're going to be utterly amazed, as I always am. We've been doing these for a decade, but I'm always surprised, and yet shouldn't be surprised. After all, we know ourselves to be extraordinarily blessed by God, and as a result, our giving has never been hindered by a fear of scarcity. But rather, it's propelled out of an awareness of these exuberant blessings that are showering down upon us every single moment of our lives, including the beauty of this glorious day today. And because that is where our gifts of time and ministry and money come from, we can continue to be a stunning reflection of the good news of God in a time and place that is just pleading for it, yearning for it, begging for it. In short, we always have what it takes. But then God gave us all that in the first place. So no wonder we can do, as Paul said, that being infinitely more than we can ever ask or imagine. So you see, even with this reading about apostles just being slaves, it really is a morning that is filled with great good news. It always has been. It always will be. Jesus would have it no other way. Amen.